All right, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to this fireside chat, Learning from Mistakes and Successes with Dr. James Kass and Kara Johnson. My name is Phil Lanier. I am president of Coaching Ourselves, and I'll help us get started today with the webinar. We are a business based out of Montreal, Canada, co-founded by myself and Professor Henry Mintzberg from McGill University. We're very proud and very happy to be able to bring you these fireside chats with our newest authors and content producers at Coaching Ourselves. And of course, today you'll be hearing from Dr. James Kass, our newest author on this wonderful theme of lessons learned. Coaching Ourselves, as I mentioned, is based out of Montreal, Canada, and we offer peer coaching programs and services to organizations around the world. Professor Henry Mintzberg, our co-founder, is fond of saying leadership, in fact, he would say management, like swimming, cannot be learned by reading about it. And what he's telling all of us is that the traditional approach of feeding content to managers and leaders in the organization under the assumption that that will make them better at their jobs and help our organizations grow and prosper is not true. Managers and leaders learn best when given a chance to reflect on their experiences and have discussions with one another about how they can improve their practice of management. And this is what Coaching Ourselves is, and this is what we do. If you're interested in learning more, please visit coachingourselves.com after this fireside chat. And now I'd like to ask both Kara and James to turn on their cameras, and we will get started with this webinar. First, I'd like to very briefly introduce Kara. Kara works with Coaching Ourselves. She's been with us for a long time. Kara is an absolute expert in many different areas of management and leadership. And she's been working with authors such as Dr. James Kass for a long time, thinking through and understanding their perspectives and their ideas and bringing that to the managers and the leaders who use our peer coaching modules. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kara to please continue the discussion.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Phil mentioned, my name is Kara, and I'm head of product development for Coaching Ourselves. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. James R. Kass, our newest author for our latest module, which is entitled Learning from Mistakes and Successes. We got to know Dr. Kass through his sister, Dr. Ray Kass, who also is one of our authors who wrote a module for us on virtual teams. So Dr. James Kass is originally from Montreal, Canada. His career has been multidisciplinary and multinational, living in 6 countries across 3 continents. He is trained as a physicist, and the early part of his career was devoted to human spaceflight across the different infrastructures of academic research, industry, and national and international agencies, such as the European Space Commission and NASA. His work spans a variety of disciplines, such as nuclear physics, neurophysiology, applied psychology, human spaceflight, integrated applications, artificial intelligence, and knowledge management. He runs a space consultancy, offers more generic support to organizations, and has advised the European Commission in the domain of knowledge management and lessons learned. So today, James will be sharing his own lessons learned about lessons learned. So welcome, James. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Kara. I'm pleased to be with you, and I'm pleased to talk about this very favorite subject of mine, lessons learned.
Excellent. So you have many interconnected areas of expertise. So what inspired you to explore this domain of lessons learned?
Well, it's interesting the way you worded the question. Across my various domains, this domain has run like a thread throughout my entire career, whether it was nuclear physics, neurophysiology, with the European Space Agency, human spaceflight, and then later on, knowledge management, AI, and all of these things. One of the things that hit me, and this hit me somewhere early on in my career, was that we were the various organizations I was working for was not properly learning from their mistakes. And when I say mistakes, they're not errors made. It's simply something that was carried out with good intentions, well-made procedures, but because of certain circumstances and because of certain unplanned interference, something went wrong, and then we learned the way to prevent it is that. And what happened was, the next mission, the same mistakes were made. And it really annoyed me, and I wondered why. There seemed to be no handover of lessons learned from the previous mission, from the previous writer of procedures. They all seemed to be doing the same thing over again. And one of the problems was that lessons and experiences was not properly handed over. We have new project leaders, new projects, newer organizations taking part, and there wasn't a proper handover, and certainly no place to look up, hey, what was learned? What should I not do wrongly? What could happen that could destroy our project and prevent it from having that fatal crisis happening? And I proposed to the European Space Agency early on, back in the mid-80s, I said, what you need is a lesson learned system. And the answer I got was, exactly, that's what we need. But we won't make one. And I said, well, why not? And they said, because nobody will look it up. People are always making mistakes, and they won't bother even reading about the mistakes of others or their predecessors. They have enough trouble learning from their own mistakes, and even that they don't learn from. Well, this person was a bit of a negative nihilist, and but nothing happened. And some 25 years later, I had the privilege of speaking with the Inspector General of the European Space Agency and talking about this very subject. And he was very keen about it. And he said, you know what? We need such a system. We've been talking about it. Why don't you create it? So finally, there was a step taken forwards. I should add that I saw a number of very major disasters happening, such as we had the Challenger disaster where the space shuttle came down, and lessons were learned from that. Well, should have been learned. But when the next disaster occurred, the Columbia, and I was in Cape Canaveral at the time when it happened, and it was my crew on board. I knew them all personally. They were all personal friends, all 7 of them. And we lost it. And when the analysis was made of this mission, one key phrase I found was, we didn't properly follow all the lessons we learned from the Challenger. There were many lessons that were followed, but there wasn't enough. And this really grieved me. Well, I won't go on much further about such failures. There were other times, other terrible failures like the Hubble telescope. And when I saw what happened there, where the calibration of an instrument was performed with an instrument that itself had some errors in it. And this is exactly what happened at an experiment at the University of Leeds, where a team had thought they had discovered a new particle. And it turned out that it was actually the calibration instrument that was faulty, and they hadn't tested it along all the points. And I thought, same thing has happened in one institution 15 years earlier, and some way, somehow, this lesson was not passed on to another. And I could list many such lessons. When the Russians were doing their spaceflight tests, they also had an accident with high percentage of oxygen where the crew were badly damaged. And then NASA had a similar problem, and they lost their 3 crew. But the Russians had never published their lesson learned. They kept it secret. So 3 had to perish with NASA because they hadn't heard about that lesson learned. And I realized these lessons learned are important, not only for the individuals, for my organization, but to share them. And this was and is my goal. I think I'll stop and maybe ask, wait for your next question.
Absolutely. One thing that you've mentioned is the importance of a holistic approach to lessons learned. When you go into an organization, what might that holistic approach look like?
Well, this is a very good question, because from what I learned from many organizations that had installed a lessons learned system, and NASA was one of them, and they now have a fairly good one, is that it's not being used enough and not being used properly. And this is a big problem. The European Space Agency also had a lessons learned system. I discovered later, every project had to write their document. And they did. Sometimes a 45-page document was very carefully written. And the lessons that were learned and the mistakes and errors and how unusual things were dealt with was all documented. And this was kept in a folder on a server where the team that had written it knew that it existed and nobody else did. NASA went a couple of steps better, and they actually put their lessons learned into a database. Well, I should say the various NASA centers created their own lessons learned system. So you kind of had to search through a few. That was the way it was at the time. And again, the problem was they started a very good idea, making it into the process of a project. But the project leaders got very irritated. Every time they had this process, they had to tick a box saying, we have looked at the lessons learned. Well, they didn't actually have to. They had instructions, and they got fed up and they stopped looking at these lessons learned. So this created a bit of a problem. And what I did when I set the system up at the European Space Agency, we decided to have a multi-pronged approach. Not only a database or an information system listing them, making it easy to find them. And when people were searching or registering, they could say what they worked and what their tags of interest were, and then they could get a notification. That was all very well. But still, we realized right at the beginning, we need to have it embedded in a process. When a project is done, milestones, similar to the way NASA did. But we went another step, and I wouldn't say NASA didn't do that because I don't know. We decided to hold a once in a month webinar, which was actually an in-person event, which we streamed to the other centers. I worked in the European Technology Center, which was the largest center of ESA with some 3,500 people in one center. And we decided to have this lunchtime or slightly before lunchtime event, which was about 1.5 hours, where we would ask a team to present what lessons they had learned. And I had the job of trying to find the teams to do it. And this proved to be a bit of a problem. As one would expect, nobody wants to hang out their mistakes. Well, actually, I coached the team and I said, well, it's not exactly a mistake that was made. It was a procedure that was not foreseen to face certain circumstances. And you handled it, and you handled it successfully. So why don't you talk about how you handled this unforeseen circumstance and you made a success of it and present it? I said, this is an interesting idea. And they came back to me. Can a couple of our team members also participate in the presentation? Because they were master of those solutions and they want to show themselves up. It's going to be recorded, and they want to be recorded about how they solved the problem. I said, certainly. And then it became an exciting presentation where they presented these unforeseen challenges which they had handled, how they handled it, and then how they suggest in the future, similar circumstances, how it should be handled. And then I coached them and I said, you should try also to see how you could make this generic, these lessons, for any circumstances, not just for the satellite you built, but even for the purchasing department, for the bureaucratic department, for the human resources department, for human space flight, for research, because actually, although you were building a satellite, your lesson could have affected many different areas. And if it's presented and your recommendations are made in such a manner that many others in different domains can also learn. And this was part of our you might say, forked approach. We also created a website, we had news stories, and this was part of the idea to create some happenings where stories were told, and then these stories would fit in to the lessons learned, you might say, the more boring part of the database. This is roughly what we would call an example of a multi-pronged, holistic approach.
You had also mentioned to me at one point how you had invited retirees to come in and to share their lessons learned within the organization.
This is a very, very, very key area, and I'm glad you brought it up, because this is what is missing in most organizations. The knowledge, the corporate knowledge, is lost when a person leaves. And often, like at the European Space Agency, by the time they retire, they have already risen up and they no longer do the actual technical work that is actually hands-on. And in their last year, they are busy trying to clear up and throw out the documents they don't need and trying to plan on which dacha they're going to purchase in order to enjoy their lives. And the last thing that is done is trying to catch them and say, hey, now you're approaching 65. Can you tell us about all your experiences? This was attempted, but it was so costly and so few were willing to invest the time and energy that it started and then stopped. And what generally happened was these just left. And I knew a lot of them because they were, I had worked with them. And immediately, before I even confronted and challenged the workers working in the agency, whom I knew were going to remain there for a while, I immediately started drawing on these retirees who had recently left and hopefully not thrown out all their electronic documents, etc., or their stuff. They had just recently retired. And I was right, they had still not cleaned up their nuisance papers, and they were simply delighted to be called back and make a presentation. And they were able to make a candid presentation to say exactly what happened and to make it entertaining as they told the stories of the past. And many of the young people were listening. They really had not heard about these interesting stories of so long ago. And this was so interesting. It was very, very challenging. We invited about half a dozen of these people. And this was really one way, an inexpensive way of bringing them back. They prepared the presentation. They had all the time in the world because they were retired. And they were able to make point by point what happened, the stories, the recommendations, the general best practices that would come out of them. And it was both a joy, entertainment, and we recorded everything, and everything was available, both the video recording as well as the PowerPoint documents. And the next job was simply to enter that into the database, which was not always carried out. That's another story.
Just to loop back to a point that you had made earlier about the importance of narrative and compelling storytelling. And I just wanted, I had shared this with you the last time we talked, and I just wanted to show the people that were here. And I had shared with you how compelling I find this little book. It's called My Best Mistake, and it's NASA's stories of learning lessons from the NASA workforce, and how this sits on my bookshelf. And while I know nothing about space, I have learned so much from this little book. I pick it up frequently. Each story is about 2 or 3 pages. And as you said, it's applicable to anyone, right? It's the lesson is applicable to anyone in whatever domain that they work in. So I found this just a really, I love the title itself, My Best Mistake. It sort of destigmatizes the idea of making a mistake. So that was something, to your point, that I have found really, really compelling. I wanted
a story is really important, because if you get a lecture of your best practices or the point-by-point errors made, you are likely to forget them all. But if you hear a story, how the person got off the plane, he went to the meeting, and this is what happens, and he was so annoyed in the evening that he got drunk, etc., and then lost his way and couldn't find his hotel, whatever. You associate, you begin to remember that lesson that was learned, associated with this interesting story that you will not forget, because it was so interesting you want to tell your family afterwards that you heard it. And that is the importance of making a story that you tell that will both entertain and have redeeming value, but that is the method of impregnating that in your head. Otherwise, you hear all kinds of advice, and really one forgets 90 or 95% of what one has heard in a lecture that will have a lot of material and little energy invested in that story. Better less material and more story.
You just said hearing these stories will really impregnate it in your head. And I've been thinking about how much easier it is to learn from failures or mistakes for so many reasons. They tend to impact us deeply. Why is it so difficult to learn from our successes? And how can we scrutinize our successes so we can learn from them like we learn from our failures?
Well, this is a very good question. You know, if you read the news, it usually talks about mistakes made, wars, people dying, the president having said the wrong thing, a faux pas, a meeting that was held and the members insulted each other. If everything went well, it doesn't seem to carry that news and that highlight that is of interest. And this is one of the problems when a ruler has ruled in a country in a very vicious manner. Yes, he gets noted in history. Ivan the Terrible became very famous because of his terribleness. He didn't become famous because of the good things he did, and he did a number of very good things before he went mad. And nobody knows about those. That part of history is not, you might say, exciting, and that has not been passed on. And this is the same thing that happens with these lessons we learn. We have our successes. The company is happy, they have made money, but there is nothing exciting when you have the Challenger accident. Everybody knows about it. If you had the Hubble telescope that needed repair, everybody knows about this error made. But the success of the Webb telescope didn't cause many headlines. There were no problems. And this is one of the problems we do have. Now, however, this is a double-edged sword. There is another aspect to it. We should try to talk about our successes, and I try to link the successes to the failures to make it interesting, because often a success is what has been drawn from the jaws of failure. And this is exciting. And this is often the case. There has been something challenging happening, and you had to handle it at the last minute, and you did it successfully, and that was a success. If you had a very good strategic planning, nobody would care about it. Even though you decided when you became president, I'm not going to take care of my 4 years, but I'm going to take care of the next 4 years. Well, what president would want to do that? He wants to only take care of his own. But if he did, nobody would pay much attention. The next president would take fly the laurels of his own success. But one of the problems is also that sometimes, and I'd like to bring this up, we declare a success something that is not a success. We may have taken a step in the corporation that we work for and increased the profits. and the corporation is very happy, and maybe even gave us a big bonus, and the bosses were extremely happy because the shareholders were able to get money back, and the boss also got his tens of millions in bonuses because of that. It could be that that success was a formula for sacrificing the future. And this is where we have to be careful. We shouldn't be simply patting ourselves on the back for our successes, but we should be candidly analyzing, was there an element of luck? Were we simply in the right place at the right time? Did it have to be that way? Couldn't we have had that success under normal circumstances without that dose of good luck? And this type of candid analysis of a success is not all frequently made and should be made. And then maybe there is something to talk about. But this is one of the problems. We should share our successes and our failures, but both our failures and successes should be very carefully analyzed. The conglomerate might increase the return to their shareholders. However, their goal is profit. Whereas in the old days, if you had a local company and the workers producing the helmet were not in some terrible place in China where they were working 80 hours a week, but in the hometown where the owner was living, then if the workers would go home and say, hey, I like the company I'm working for, the owner has taken care of our family. And this has happened. There was one company in Germany which since more than 100 years has existed, and they had some rather bad stories through the Second World War, but they took care of their workers. Krups was the company. They actually took care of the health care of their workers and the education of their workers. And they produced the first, you might say, almost social system of healthcare because they had so many workers, and the workers knew they had a permanent job and would never be fired. The company managers and owner, even the owner's wife, who was a multi-zillionaire, would visit sick workers in hospital. And the workers knew their children would get an education. And the company knew they were getting actually loyal workers who were well-trained, but would stay with the company because of all the good conditions of healthcare. And this was what one might call the family company in that region. Nowadays, it's no longer the case. You have a conglomerate. They're owned by shareholders, and the shareholders really don't know where the workers are and are not interested. They look at the figures at the end, are they red or black? And that's all they want. And so we have lost something in our society that I think famous words used by Minster, the balance of where we look into our market economy has turned into a capitalist economy where it only means how much money you make rather than serving your customers well. This has been something which we have lost, and there are lessons here to be learned, which will probably go into some other questions you will ask me later, maybe.
Well, I mean, you touched upon the point of security. Just we all need that security and comfort, obviously, and support from our organization, also in order to have the strength to say, hey, I made a mistake, or I see you've made a mistake. I'm also wondering, how do you know you're learning the right lessons when you make a mistake? This is something that I'm always fascinated by, even within our very small organization, how we each have extracted very different personal lessons. And sometimes I think, well, some are more valid than others.
Yes, it's a very good question. And one of the problems is, if I'm in a team and I realize I have been rude to the section head, because I had my own ideas and I tried to present them, and I presented them in a way critical to the way he was working, and then he criticized me, and I learned my lesson. Yeah, don't bring something up that could be controversial. Is this the right lesson? I have dealt with a customer and it went wrong. And I think I have learned a lesson. Now, if I share this with one of my team members and tell him, he'll say, you know what? That's the wrong lesson you've learned. Actually, that is not what you should be learning from this experience. I had something similar, and you know what? There is a different way to look at it. And when you do that, you will see if you had approached the customer differently, if you had approached the section head, maybe we could have gone forward. Don't learn that wrong lesson, learn the right one. But how do I know this? I need some feedback from the outside. I am the one affected, and I'm unable to see in my own home, in my own self, what is really happening. I need a neutral party outside of me who understands me and my work sufficiently. And that is why it is so important to be able to share your lessons learned with your colleagues rather than hiding them. And then you can begin to understand what is the real lesson that I'm learning. If you can even share it with a section head who is heading your team, not be embarrassed, because he might say, no, don't worry about it. You have learned the wrong lesson. Actually, your approach was not bad. This time it was the customer who was wrong, but I'll advise you how to handle it. You wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't share it. You might make the wrong lesson and learn the wrong lesson. It is important to share it with others. That is why the importance of sharing lessons learned with the members of your team in an organization. The other thing is, I may add, while we are on that question of knowing it's the right lesson, is asking the right question and demanding the right answer. And this is a real problem. You might be asking the wrong question. You are looking at a problem, whatever it may be, but if you ask the wrong question, you will get the wrong answer. If you are looking to see whether you have been having whether your company is polluting too much or whatever, if you ask the wrong question, you will see the wrong result. And this can happen very easily. And this is happening all the time. We use statistics for everything, but when we look at it rationally and critically, we often see we have asked the wrong question and you get the wrong answer. Even in artificial intelligence, the famous or infamous statement made is rubbish in, rubbish out. So AI won't work if you feed in the wrong information and ask the wrong question. I can also give you details eventually, but this is part of the thing, is trying to understand the right questions that should be asked. And by sharing it with others, sometimes somebody else can say, hey, you're asking the wrong question. Ask a different question and you'll get a totally different answer. And this is a very important thing. It is correct in companies, politics, the media, everything, whether it's criticizing the government, criticizing the police states, police killing people, whatever. If you are asking the wrong questions, you will get the wrong answer in your statistics, and you will think, and this you will see even in very good news media, even with good journalists, they will ask the wrong questions, often because those are the ones that are acceptable.
You're touching upon the point of talking to as many people as possible, also getting as many different perspectives in. Could you talk about going outside of organizations for lessons learned and sharing information?
This is a very critical thing. Now, when I set up the system at the European Space Agency, my boss told me, no way we're going to publish these. This is only for our staff. Maybe we shouldn't even allow the contractors. Well, maybe we'll allow the contractors, but maybe not. I said, oh, you know, NASA is doing it differently. They're actually publishing their lessons learned. After all, the taxpayer is paying. And the public has to know what happened with Challenger, what happened wrong, what happened with Columbia. So yes, if the Russians had published their error they made with oxygen, it would have saved lives of others. So there is a place to share lessons. And this is where some public organizations are sharing lessons. Whether they're sharing all of them, I don't know. I know that NASA does share their lessons learned. NATO also has a very good lessons learned system, but for various security reasons, they don't share their lessons. But that is quite understandable. Now, what happens with a company? It's a difficult thing. There is one company, for example, Unilever, who publishes their lessons learned. Now, whether they publish all of them, I don't know. It's good advertising for the company, but the company has a very good reputation. It has 3 pillars of concern in the company: their workers, their customers, and their shareholders. And as a result, they have there is one item missing, that is the general public, because now we are beginning to see there is an element where we serve the public. Are we polluting? Are we doing damage to the environment? This is also for the general public. And it is a difficult thing. Companies often use such publishing lessons learned to advertise themselves in a good way. But why not, if it's honest what they're saying? Yes, I can understand an organization not wanting to share all their lessons. However, I still think it is important that they do publish their lessons learned, because somewhere along the line, the skeletons will come out of the closet. And the best way to avoid having skeletons come out of a closet is not to allow them in the closet in the first place, rather than hiding them. So having an internal lessons learned system could be, this is the way of hiding your skeletons. That could be a lesson that is learned. Make sure you don't have leaks. What happens in a government when a leak comes out, showing something terrible that the government has done? The immediate reaction is to punish, find who the leaker was and punish him, not to correct that terrible scandal that has been published, because the leaker evidently was having no success within that organization. He was trying to whistleblow the formal way. Nobody was listening. And he finally decided to leak and go into the public. And what does that organization or that government do? They try to punish the whistleblower. And this is the wrong thing. So this is where we have a bit of a problem. I think it is much safer when a company has discovered that something has gone terribly wrong to share it. If they have not handled their ransomware hack very well, share it. Other companies can learn. Your customers will know that you are learning lessons. Otherwise, it will come out at one point, and then people will say, why didn't you tell us? Tell us right away. Tell them right away.
And I would hope in our current context that as we go forward in the world, we're not just sharing the things that go terribly wrong, but we're also sharing our discoveries and the things that are going right. I was reading, just for example, I think it's Levi's that shares their technology, for sustainable production. I don't know to what extent, but I certainly hope that we see that more going forward, that people are sharing their lessons learned and their best practices, so that on a societal level, on a global level, we can better deal with all of these crises that we're currently facing and will continue to mount going forward, probably.
Well, I think this is terribly true. We now have a COVID crisis in the world, and we have seen how many governments have handled it very badly. Some governments have handled it well, in manners that cannot be passed on to us, to our Western governments, maybe because of data privacy. But there is a lot that we can learn from each other instead of making excuses. So our governments, when we didn't have enough masks available, said that masks weren't important. It's a good excuse. And once masks were available, they said, well, they now discovered that masks would be useful. And this is not the way to go about it. One really has to share the mistake and learn from another government who has said, yes, we didn't have enough masks. And what we did was we advised people to use 2 or 3 pieces of cloth, which had a 70%, not 100%, but it made them aware of the importance of passing on the virus. And then they began to keep their distance. When you say masks are not important, then you can't tell people keep 1.5 meters apart. If you are, so your lie in a way harms you. If you have learned a lesson, publish it, let others know how you have solved it. And many governments did publish their results. They were proud of it. Others hid their successes because maybe they were not quite sure of what was going on. Yes, I do think that we have a problem sharing these little successes amongst each other so that we can be better as a world community, because the less COVID spread we have across the whole world, the less we will be damaged ourselves. So it's not a matter of keeping it to yourself. Let us share. So it will make the whole world a better place, whether it be for the climate, pollution, or whatever.
Just want to bring it back to your module that you've written. There's a part of the module where, if it's appropriate to the participants, they can start thinking about designing their own lessons learned process for their own organization. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of everybody being involved in doing this?
Yes. No, there's such a thing as, first, one shoe doesn't fit everybody. So taking on a company that says we have the best lessons learned system and we can sell it to you, the likelihood is they're going to give you a certain shoe size because that's what they've spent millions in developing, and try to fit your organization to it. Sometimes an organization has to fit to an application, yes. However, the importance of an organization taking ownership is that they feel it is their own system that applies to them, because this generic system that may be that one size may not fit all companies and all organizations. A public organization has slightly different boundaries and parameters than a private organization. A charity also has different boundaries. An NGO has different boundaries. And therefore, we have different types of systems. If we allow the workers to bottom-up design the system, that will give them a certain amount of ownership. On the other hand, if you want to have success, it has to be top-down management agreeing and stating that this is important and that you can invest your time doing this and that you should invest your time doing this. So without the blessing from on high, then you will get nowhere. But if you have that blessing and then you allow your working group, maybe with an external consultant, to work together to adapt some system that is best useful for your own organization, and then you put in a few of your own added aspects to it. We want a blog, we want a feedback, we want to have some kind of a storytelling lunch hour once a week or whatever, then that can be an adaptation that they have created. And then those are more enthusiastic because they understand the culture of their own company. And then they have developed ownership for this tool rather than having imposed on them.
I was just going to say that you then gave a variety of examples. What if you don't have the blessing of senior management? What if you have somebody like you were mentioning that you spoke to that said, we don't want this system? So what's, let's say somebody who's a middle manager, they feel inspired about this. What actions can they take?
Well, I will say that I made a great mistake when I first advised or proposed to the European Space Agency to create a lesson learned system, and then they turned down my proposal. I stopped there. I should have carried on. Keep trying. Wait till the next person in charge. Go to someone else. And I had that same problem when I went to the European Commission. I had an idea and I wanted to present it to them, and I presented it to the wrong person. He said we didn't need it. I said, well, could there be somebody else whom I should talk to? He said, yes. Go and talk to so-and-so. Stop talking to me. Well, I got pushed along to roughly about half a dozen different steps. It took me maybe 6 or 8 months. I finally found somebody who was interested. So I will say, yes, one person, junior person, can affect a huge company if he believes in himself and he keeps trying. It's sometimes a single idea can change a whole organization, can even change a country. Believe in yourself and believe that you can make the change, and believe, make this a dream, and it may not happen this year, but it may happen next year, it may happen the year after. You will then, if you keep it in your forefront. I had a dream to work in human spaceflight, and the doors did not open at the beginning, but eventually I noticed certain doors and they did open, and my dream did come fully true, exactly the way I dreamt it. So that is possible. Have your dream. Is it important to you? And if that is important to you, then try. Keep it at your forefront. Tell your best friends. Tell them at various meetings. Some people will get tired of you. Somewhere along the line, the right person, it will ring a bell and they will accept it.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to end and segue into questions and answers.
Excellent. Thank you, Kara and James. We do have at least one question, and then I've got a personal question too. So we'll start with a question from Adel. Adel asks, what have you seen are reasons groups, big and small, have not embraced the idea of learning from failures and sharing them? Is it pride or ego? Is it a tyranny of the urgent?
It is combination. There is that urgent, and we are always in most organizations trying to catch up with that deadline. And this goes both for industry and in governmental organizations. Whether you believe it or not, even these civil service type organizations are under great pressure in their work. And the last thing one wants to do is spend time discussing what went wrong and how it was handled. This is one of the problems. The other problem is that, yes, there is still that association that if you talk about something that went wrong, it sounds bad. Better keep it in your section, keep it in your team, or keep it to yourself, because it may look bad. The last thing you want to do when you're having your monthly directorate meeting to present, this is what we have done wrong, these are our mistakes, and these are our successes in facing these challenges. They prefer to say everything is going quite normal. So it's a combination of those things. We also feel that the lesson I have learned is only me. It's only this particular team. We cannot understand that actually this could be something that 1,000 others may be suffering from as well. We don't think it's necessary. It's just this little thing that our little team has, and we really don't have to make a big thing of it. And this is what is wrong. There is something that could apply to everybody.
Excellent, thank you. And just to follow up on that question for Adel, what advice would you have for Adel or somebody like him who was asking, how do we disrupt this way of thinking so that lesson learned becomes the norm rather than the exception?
Well, what I have experienced is I was often very hesitant to open my mouth at a meeting. I figured I would be the only person to make this disruptive suggestion, and I would annoy both my team members and the team leader, and I hesitated. However, even with a horrible team leader, I have noticed that sometimes this disruptor actually gets a reaction. Oh, that's the way I felt as well. Yes, and becomes a chain reaction. And the team leader, who may be a horrible person, says, that's exactly what I was waiting for, somebody to say something like this. And we are often hesitant because we think that we are going to be criticized, we are going to lose our own respectability. It's just better keep your mouth shut about that. Don't try to disrupt. We are hesitant. A disruptor is not a revolutionary for the purpose of making trouble. He is a person who sometimes asks a question which is quite challenging, and his purpose is not necessarily to disrupt. If it is, he will be criticized and he will get annoyance as a result, but people will notice whether he is that kind of person or simply really sincerely saying, I have difficulty understanding why our team is not looking at it this way. And we are too hesitant. Don't be afraid. I was far too afraid. It is possible. Do make the suggestion. Get out of your shell, and you won't be bitten as you may think you will be bitten.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question, and this is Phil of Coaching Ourselves. As a small organization, we're starting to apply some of the lessons learned that we've learned through your work. Do you have any recommendations on any tools that we might look at to try, and then any processes that we might be able to mimic or start from as we build up our capacity to do lessons learned?
It's a good question. Now, most organizations prefer not to publish their tools. There's one organization I know who does publish their tools and processes, and that's NATO, that I would suggest that you look at that source. They do have lessons learned team that is part of the organization. I do not know much about other organizations that really publish many details. NATO is interesting in that they publish very well how they do, but they don't publish any lessons learned. Others will publish lessons learned and don't publish how they do it. I don't want to boast of myself, but I've had some experience organizing a lessons learned conference in space flight, and where industry and agencies presented their problems a little bit more openly than they would to the general public in setting up such a system. Because this was a big problem, is not simply making that database. They were excellent. I went to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. They were already creating a wonderful Excel file. I thought it was excellent. It was an Excel file, but that's another matter. They did tell me that they had 3 pillars there. Their prosecutors, their judges, and the defense team. And these teams kept separate. They were not supposed to affect each other. So of course that their lessons learned will not be shared with the others. Why not? So there are some problems with that. There are a number of companies who try to share their experience in setting up lessons learned systems, and some of them might be good. I'm not very familiar. I myself think that I could advise on such things. At least I could say how we have faced it in agencies and in the space industry. So other than going to the NATO website, which really has a lot of details, and I'm not a fan of a lot of what NATO is doing or their policies, but I certainly believe, and I once belonged to one of the standardization committees in the medical domain of NATO. They do have remarkably detailed information on their website.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I do have a follow-up question. Could you share with us your thinking or perspectives on trends in lessons learned, both processes or systems. In other words, in 5 or 10 years, how do you see the evolution of lessons learned concept and systems? Will it be more agile? Will it be more inter-organizational, etc.? Anything, insights you could share with us about the future?
Well, we will have a problem with big data. We are learning a lot. There's so much information. We have a deluge of information. And organizations are beginning to realize that lessons learned is a good thing. Because they see logistics failed during the COVID crisis, or the Suez Canal was stuck and they didn't have their contingency. There were lessons to be learned there. So there is a trend where organizations are beginning to realize, unfortunately not much in the way of governments, but at least many industrial organizations are beginning to realize it is worth going in that direction. But we have a problem. The trend may be to collect too many lessons and have a deluge of information, and then it will lose its usefulness again. And this is what one of the organizations, Astrium, that's in Germany, the aerospace and similar industries all combined together across Europe, set up a lesson learned system, and they even invested in one of their vice presidents having to spend 40% of his time or 50% of his time on this. So they considered it important, and their various 3 or 4 branches had to have one guru, very senior, in charge of that. They found it extremely important to move in that direction. So they began to invest. So this is, I believe, the trend, and certainly should be. How we are going to deal with it, we may have to also use things like artificial intelligence in order to help the lessons learned system inform potential people who will need a lesson learned at a certain time in this project, an appropriate one, to be able to identify and send them a notification. This is the kind of thing that may be, you might say, a step into the future, because we have too much information available.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. I'd like to turn it over to Kara and James to give us some final closing words for this webinar.
Actually, if it's okay with you, Phil, there's just one more question. Could I ask it?
Please.
That was put into the chat. It says, do you have guidance around keeping judgment out of capturing lessons learned?
Actually, a very prescient and important question. I missed this, so I thank you for sending the question. We tend to look at a mistake as somebody to blame. And this is the wrong approach. And this should be spat upon and should be eschewed, such an approach. One should not try to judge and blame. We should accept an error as being our error, something that happened with us, not a particular person, and see how we can handle it. And anybody who makes a statement of judgment and blame should really get a severe scolding. This should be a guideline in any lessons learned team, that you are not allowed to blame or judge. You really should be looking at things openly and understandingly. A very important point. Thank you for the question.
James, before we finish up, did you have anything final that you wanted to add?
Well, I will say that lessons learned is, for me, has become, in a way, one of my favorite but important aspects in my life. I have a long career behind me, and as you can see in my white hair, that I'm no longer very young, and I'm over the normal age of people carrying on their regular work. I see a great importance in all domains of learning lessons and critical thinking, which is missing. We are fed information from television and everything else. We no longer read books where we see all the details, and we are beginning to lose the ability of analyzing what is being fed to us. We will fall asleep in front of the television instead of analyzing the film we have watched and say, those are the 10 errors they made, totally ridiculous. We have lost that, and we are losing that even more because we have the mountain of information from social media, from mainstream media, from wherever else, from Wikipedia, from WikiLeaks, and everywhere, and we don't know what to do with it. And I was asked the question, how can you tell what is fake and what is not fake? And I said, actually, if you ask the right questions and you critically, properly think about it, then you will arrive at a conclusion whether this accusation that a government is making is right or fake. Because a lie is difficult to live by itself. It only succeeds because the listener has stopped, he has turned off his brain to critical thinking. And this is where I would really love to spread this word and share it even with companies and other organizations. It's not simply a lecture, set up a lesson learned system. It's much more than that. How to ask questions, how to critically think, how to apply those, how to change. It can change our lives, it can change our politics, and it should change the way the world is run, whether our whole climate is warming, where all the pollution we are producing and the wars we are waging. I believe most of it is totally unnecessary if we would learn the proper lessons and think properly and critically and apply that to our lives. I really think we should believe and we can make a better world from what we have, and we should. Thank you.
Thank you. You've been such an impassioned, you're so passionate about what you do. It's wonderful to have you here as a guest, and we're so grateful to you to partnering with us for our module. So thank you for coming here today, and I'd like to thank all of our guests for staying with us. And did you have anything to add, Phil, just to finish?
I will double that. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. James Kass. Thank you, Cara. And thank you, everybody, for coming to our fireside chat today.